there is a clear connection between the three major events that took place in South Asia in 1984 between the Sikhs on the one hand and the Indian nation state on the other. All three major events were termed operations by the Indian nation state. Bluestar, of which is known about quite widely, the invasion of the Darbar Sahib at Amritsar. Woodrose, of which much less is known, but was an incursion into other key gurdwara around the state at the same time and for months afterwards. Finally, Operation Shaanti, which was an overall attack that was targeting Sikhs across the nation and was meant to be a final solution. That particular operation never took place, but what we do know is that it was planned, and some have argued that the events of Delhi that took place in November following the assassination of Indira Gandhi were a smaller version of the operation that was slanted as Shaanti. All three of these were termed operations and have a key thread running through them, which is best depicted by the anthropologist Joyce Pettigrew, who, when talking about Operation Bluestar, described it as being the suppression of the culture of a people, attacking their heart and striking a blow at their spirit and self-confidence. All three of these operations did that. All three involved the invasion and taking control of key gurdwara. Whether it was in Delhi in November, whether it was throughout the months of the summer across the Punjab from Patiala to Ludhiana and everywhere in between, or whether of course it was in June itself when the Holy Darbar Sahib and the Akal Takht were brought under Indian Armed Force control. There was of course elsewhere the stopping of Sikhs from rallying at key positions like Anandpur, but again of course the Darbar Sahib complex itself, which historically had been the place that Sikhs would come to. And then of course there was the overall arching aim that came through in all three major events, the curtailing of Sikh activism that had been rife for over a decade prior to the year of 1984. Throughout all three operations, if we want to use their terminology, there was a media blackout and a control on what was being put out, not only in India, but worldwide, in European press, North American broadcast, and everything else in between. There were forced entries put onto Sikh households under the guise of curtailing terrorist activity. And then, most notably and distressingly, were the extrajudicial killings that took place, not only during Bluestar, but during Woodrose most prominently, and then of course through the event that came to represent what Shaanti was. The fact that all three of these events have been disconnected from one another shows that we, even as Sikhs, have not understood them, let alone the rest of the world understanding what took place. We don't like to term them as operations. It was an invasion of the Darbar Sahib. And yes, while using that terminology is correct for us, what we have to keep in mind is that takes us away from the sheer level of planning and strategy that was involved with tackling the Darbar Sahib, with taking out Sikhs across the entire Punjab, preventing them from coming into Amritsar. And then, of course, annihilating an entire people who number in the millions across the subcontinent. That disconnection of the three events and not looking at them in unison brings a focus instead on the personalities, whether it's Sant Jarnail Singh in June or whether in November it's the likes of Jagdish Taitla and HKL Bhagat, who were involved in orchestrating the genocide across Delhi of Sikhs. And of course, most importantly, by disconnecting all three events, we do not allow reparations, we do not allow retaliation, and we do not allow redress to take place in any cohesive matter. It should come as no surprise that Sikhs worldwide are beginning to wake up now, some 30 years after those events, to look at what avenues are open to us to try and rectify the situation. But perhaps, to some extent, it is already too late. These three major events that are now culminated and depicted by this one word of 1984 has become a bogey word. and has become an all-encapsulating word that people use to switch off, when in fact it should be a word used to switch on. So in a nutshell, just what is it that took place in that first week of June in 1984 when the Indian Armed Forces invaded the Darbar Sahib Amritsar in that operation that they termed Bluestar? Well, of course, things started some time before that. We can go back to the Asian Games that took place in Delhi in December of 1982. Sikhs had planned to travel to Delhi to protest at the Games for the way that the Punjab was being treated, and in particular how Sikhs were being handled by the state. That they were prevented from doing so, from travelling through the state of Haryana, and those that did appear at Delhi were being mistreated en masse, meant that Sikhs tried to look at different ways to try and resolve this situation going forward. 2 meetings were called at the Darbar Sahib complex in the latter part of 1982 and in the early weeks of 1983. One of these meetings was for the wide range of intelligentsia that existed among Sikhs, editors, thinkers, academics and the like, to look at different avenues for how to take on the agitation. But another meeting was called, one that was for ex-servicemen, strategic people, people from within the military who could turn up anonymously. At that meeting, there was at least some piece of information that was shared that perhaps there was an inkling of the Darbar Sahib being invaded. We know this because from this time period onwards, activity at the Darbar Sahib, particularly in terms of looking at the complex and working out where things could be defended, started to begin. Of course, at the very same time, the Indian Armed Forces across the entire next 18 months started practicing maneuvers to invade the Darbar Sahib, mostly out of sight of public and prying eyes in the Chakrata Masuri mountain range. Following this, when we get to the actual week of the events, we find on the 31st of May in 1984, the Shromani Akali Dal Sikh political party making an announcement as to how the agitation is going to progress. They made a revelation to state that from that moment onwards, Sikhs would refuse to pay land and water bills. But most importantly, that a few days from then, all grain shipments out of the state travelling across the country would be prevented. That was massive because it accounted for something like 60% of India's entire grain output. The fact that the Darbar Sahib invasion coincides with when this activity was supposed to begin on June the 3rd is no coincidence. The next day, we know that on the 1st of June, some 7 hours worth of firing on buildings around the complex takes place by the army that has now amassed into the tens of thousands around Amritsar. No less than 300 bullets are found within the Darbar Sahib itself. By the next day, Amritsar had become a restricted area and it was a no-go zone. And by the 3rd of June, when the invasion started proper, there was a complete media blackout. What we start to see then on the 4th of June is the operation as we all understand it. Bombs began to drop, firing began, and some troops started to move into the complex. Within the complex itself, there were masses of everyday Sikhs who had attended since as early as the 1st of June for the martyrdom of the 5th Guru Nanak, Guru Arjan Dev. That these people had been allowed into the Darbar Sahib on that day, but had since not been allowed to leave, is again no coincidence. And it meant that the death toll following the invasion was that much higher. Those bombs that began to drop on the Darbar Sahib complex did not just target the Ramgarhia Bunga or other fortified settlements that the government had identified. They were also dropped and firing and shelling began on the Langar Hall, on the Nanak Nivas residences that everyday people were residing in. By the 5th of June, what we find is a complete mass scale invasion of the Darbar Sahib complex. The Raggis of the Darbar Sahib themselves, who had remained within the Darbar Sahib confines and had continued recitation of Gurbani through Shabad Kirtan, found themselves targeted. The head Raggi of the Darbar Sahib at that time, Amrik Singh, was shot and killed in the midst of reciting Kirtan aloud through the megaphones. By the 6th of June, the Indian government had ordered for an onslaught onto the Akal Takht. A full frontal assault was begun, but was very quickly repelled. And so the decision was taken to roll in over a dozen armed personnel carriers and tanks. Those are the images that most people remember seeing the most on news footage that followed later, of Indian Armed Forces tanks rolling into the Darbar Sahib and going across the Parikrama, taking out major buildings with their shelling throughout. Following this, and by the end of the invasion, we found that the Darshni Duri, the doorway in the complex that splits the Akal Takht at one end and the Darbar Sahib in the middle of the holy tank, was completely set ablaze, and with it went many priceless treasures and manuscripts. As well, the Sikh reference library was looted. Out of some 2,500 manuscripts, and particularly Guru Granth Sahib recensions, only some 200 were ever found. Priceless heirlooms that had existed for hundreds of years disappeared, right down to the smallest things like the mala, the prayer bead that was used by the last Sikh king, Maharaja Dalip Singh. Following the entire invasion of the Darbar Sahib, the government had identified that some 500 civilians were casualties of this operation, and that some 70 to 80 members of the armed forces themselves had been killed. Yet the true figure is much, much higher. Many authors and human rights organizations have picked the figure of people killed as being above 20,000. The invasion of the Darbar Sahib in June 1984 of itself would have been a very singular event, but of course it would have instigated riotous scenes across the Punjab, as people would have awoken to find their beloved Darbar Sahib and Akal Takht the scene of an invasion. This is a fact that would not have been lost on the invaders, the Indian government, and so some have argued there was an accompanying operation that was put into place, that termed Woodrose. Many researchers and academics have argued that this operation existed because of a number of elements that came to the fore through Bluestar itself, but then through the months that followed the invasion of the Darbar Sahib, through the disappearances of countless Sikhs and the numerous abuses that were met out. During the invasion of the Darbar Sahib, there were a number of elements that pointed to this being more than a singular event. The fact that all travel across Amritsar was prevented. People were forbidden from leaving their homes. A shoot-on-sight policy was instigated. All services into and outside of Amritsar themselves were also blocked. And of course, there was a blanket media ban on all broadcasts. Moreover than this, though, the government would have feared reprisals from villagers, particularly those close to Amritsar, who would have tried to travel into the city to try and prevent or at least rebuff the Indian invasion. There are examples of this. There were 30,000 Sikh villagers who gathered at the village of Gohewal, carrying pitchforks, who were then met by the brute Indian armed forces that assassinated them all on the spot. The same took place in other places. At the village of Harike Patla, again, another 30,000 gathered to travel to Amritsar, but were prevented from doing so and faced murder. Similarly, at Mehta Chowk, a stronghold of the Sikhs, particularly those who were involved in the agitation against the government, some 20,000 Sikhs gathered, but were rebuffed from traveling to Amritsar. And again, elsewhere, at the village of Hir, 1,000 villagers gathered who were prevented from moving forward. Although Operation Woodrose is not mentioned in any publicly available documents, rumours of its existence and the name itself have been leaked over the last 30 years. Arguments exist that some 74 key Gurdwara around the Punjab were targeted specifically and were invaded at the same time as the Darbar Sahib. Key activists were arrested and taken out of the Gurdwara. Some of the examples that we have involve Gurdwara Dukh Niwaran in Patiala, where over 270 young Sikhs were assassinated within the confines of the Gurdwara. Also elsewhere, we found at Dera Baba Shyam Singh that border security forces, the BSF, invaded the Gurdwara and looted it of many priceless relics, as well as the entire Golk, the fund that existed there. But it is what took place in the months following June that are of most concern. Recorded figures show that at least 8,000 young turbaned Sikhs disappeared in the months from June to November alone. These were highly targeted disappearances, young men who left their homes and didn't return that same night. The most emotional of all events that took place in 1984 is, of course, the violence that was perpetrated in Delhi, specifically in November, following the assassination of the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. It is said that she was assassinated by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards in vengeance for what she had done by invading the Darbar Sahib. And, as a result, many of her supporters and ordinary citizens, particularly those in Delhi who were so distraught at her assassination, took their vengeance in turn on the Sikhs that they encountered throughout the capital city. But here is where we start to find a number of problems. Quite specifically, that this is termed riots is where the problems begin. Riots, mob violence, is something that happens spontaneously. Whilst much of the violence that we see perpetrated in November of 1984, again centering in Delhi, takes place in an organized and very structured manner, almost as if it was pre-planned. This is where we find the work of one Dr. Sangat Singh starting to develop an idea that had, until the publishing of his book, The Sikhs in History, had been only rumour. Some people had suggested that Indira Gandhi had a much bigger plan to utilise in annihilating the Sikhs throughout the country, that the invasion of the Darbar Sahib, Operation Bluestar, was step 1, that the attack and disappearances of Sikh youth throughout the months that followed through Operation Woodrose was step 2, and to strike a real blow at the heart of the Sikh people across the country and force an annihilation of sorts would take place pretty soon from when she was actually assassinated. The rumours suggested that this operation even had a name, that it was termed Shaanti. It's quite funny to think that a word meaning peace and contentment would be used for such devious means. But Sangat Singh writes in The Sikhs in History that Operation Shaanti was very real. The author himself had belonged to a ministry in the 1960s that belonged to part of the Indian central government. By the 1970s, he was a key member of intelligence. And so, many people have taken his words as having real authority, that there is some truth to this idea that Operation Shaanti was something that was going to be brought into being. What took place when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, it is then suggested, is a mini version, if you like, of what Operation Shaanti would have really been. Some of that which we see that took place in the violence in November points to the fact that this was orchestrated and organized, pre-planned to an extent, and was not spontaneous. There is the fact that so many of the crowbars and iron rods that were being used to attack Sikh businesses, homes, and individuals themselves were all of the exact same size. Not roughly the same size, but exactly the same size, as if they had all been cut to measure and were all being distributed to people who were perpetrating the violence. There is the fact that the police themselves were disarming Sikhs instead of protecting them from violence, thereby allowing the perpetrators of the violence to attack Sikhs en masse, where they were not able to protect themselves. The fact that some have suggested they were under orders to do so points to this being an orchestrated, planned event. There were numerous MPs who were present at different locations throughout the next 10 days following Indira Gandhi's assassination. And again, it has been argued that they had gathered there to target individual people and locations that would be next on the hit list for perpetrators to go and seek out Sikhs to kill. Such lists of where Sikhs existed in a capital city would have to have existed prior to Indira Gandhi's assassination and been easily accessible on the night following her assassination for the perpetrators to go out and find these Sikhs en masse and start assassinating them and looting their shops, again pointing to this being a pre-planned and orchestrated event. A number of ideas have been presented in the various commissions and inquiries that have been held into the events of November 1984 to suggest that there is more to the mob violence that was being perpetrated, that it wasn't spur of the moment. These were not riots, that they were orchestrated and pre-planned. It was put to the Nanavati Commission that Congress leaders had conspired not only to select the locations and the specific targets, but which orders would be put to members of the armed forces and the police when dealing with the situations that they would find on the ground. Further still, certain key witnesses put to the Nanavati Commission that they specifically heard members of police forces telling mob members that they could loot and kill as much as they wanted. They had carte blanche to do as they wanted. At the PUDR inquiry, a journalist made the claim that the army had told him they had no orders to help people who were being burnt alive before their very eyes. These are not the acts of individuals who were acting out of emotion and hatred for Sikhs, who they saw equally to blame as the two bodyguards who had assassinated Indira Gandhi. But these are the acts of people following orders, who are following a chain of command, who are seeking out an operation that had been planned to take place some weeks in the future and was now being put on at the spur of the moment.